to do that. We're close. All right, well, thank you all for coming to the Adobe Creative Cloud live session. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our panelist here, Joseph Labrecque. Why don't you go ahead and take off?
All right, thank you. So, hi everyone. So this is Adobe Creative Cloud Live, and the format of this is going to be sort of like, I want it to be kind of like informative, but also allow time for discussion and questions, things like that. The way I'm looking at this is, people who are trying to, get a better understanding of Creative Cloud and the applications involved in it, and, just how things work, and, just what particular things are, might have a lot of my main for this particular presentation is to give some information, to give an overview of things and different groups of applications and the sorts of things that you can achieve with this stuff. And then to kind of really open it up to, any questions that you have. So if you have questions about like, well, should I use like this application over this application if the project that I'm assigning, is of this type, right? I mean, that's a very specific one, but it could be something as simple as why would I want to use X over Y or whatever. So that's the, my main driver here, what I'm looking to accomplish through this. So hopefully towards the end, after the initial slides, we can actually, either take questions through the chat or even through anything else. And I mean, I really don't care if people ask questions during the presentation as well. So feel free to go ahead and like pop stuff in the chat. I am going to, I've got a couple monitors here in front of me and I'm moving the chat over here so I can see it a little bit better. And yeah, so let's go. All right, I think I can just use my mouse here to get these slides. Yeah, there we go. So again, I'm Joseph Labrecque. I'm currently Instructor of Technology at University of Colorado Boulder. So I work in the advertising, PR, and media design department. And I'm also affiliated very closely with a lot of different Adobe units. So mostly community stuff around education. I'm an education leader, partner by design, and also a community professional. I do a lot of additional work, authoring on all of these different things. So, mostly around Adobe Animate. It's kind of like my focus when it comes to authoring. I've got a number of books and LinkedIn Learning courses and things like that around Adobe Animate and some other products. But in terms of my teaching, my role at the university is basically to just teach all of the people all the students that come into the department to get them proficient enough with all of the Adobe Creative Cloud that they'll be able to take that and, use that knowledge in their other classes as they move ahead, as they move up into junior and senior and so forth and take advanced classes. They're able to easily identify what they want to do and what the proper applications, creative software applications that they'd be able to use to do that. So it's kind of my job to know all this stuff in and out, right? So here's just a couple of shout outs here to my latest publications. So, feel free to check any of that stuff out. Also, there's my LinkedIn Learning author profile down there. It's linkedin.com/learning/instructors Joseph-Labrecque. So I know a lot of universities have access to LinkedIn Learning and lynda.com. We do at University of Colorado Boulder for sure. And yeah, it's a great resource that I think is underutilized in education, especially when we have to do all this stuff online at this point anyway. All right, so Adobe Creative Cloud. People are often a little confused about what Creative Cloud means exactly, with a lot of different things. Like if you think about Microsoft Office 365 or other cloud-based services, lots of times that means that you open up a web browser and you go online and you're able to use, Microsoft Word online, or you're using Google Docs online. It's in the cloud, right? And there are components of that are very similar when it comes to Adobe's Creative Cloud. But primarily, Adobe's Creative Cloud is simply a way to sort of manage and distribute and, just sort of deal with this mass of applications and services that are available when you have a subscription, whether it's an enterprise subscription that a lot of universities have that students can get, or even just an individual subscription that you might have just gotten from like a month-to-month type thing, or however it might work, right? And there's really like three main parts of Creative Cloud. There is the desktop applications, and there are many desktop applications, things like Photoshop and Illustrator and After Effects and Premiere and Animate and so forth. So these are things that you just download through Adobe Creative Cloud, install on your desktop or laptop, and use in that way. So you're using them on your machine installed. But there is a web component as well. The web component can be things like Adobe Spark products. So ways of creating, kind of like, simpler graphics and, basic one-page websites online. And those are generally web-based projects, right? So you just go to spark.adobe.com and you go and you just start creating stuff, and it all happens on the web. There are also things like Adobe Fonts. So Adobe Fonts is this massive collection of professional typefaces that you can download with your subscription. And there's actually no limit anymore on the amount of fonts that you can license and download. And you can use those across the desktop applications once they're downloaded, but you can also use them in other applications you might have on your machine, like, again, Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, and so forth. So it's a really nice resource. Again, not a lot of people know about it. There's also a mobile component to this. So there are a number of different mobile applications as well that are part of Creative Cloud. And these can go anywhere from dedicated Spark-based applications for Android and iOS, or they could be something as powerful as Photoshop on iPad, or something like Adobe Aero, which is an augmented reality application you can install on an iPad. So I thought for next, we could go through and, I tend to sort of block these different applications off into groups that I think make the most sense for people to understand. So this first grouping is I called it photography and painting. So as I go through these different categories, some of these may sort of overlap. So there's obviously certain applications that can go basically anywhere, but I've tried to identify like pretty much the strengths and the big use cases for these applications and group them accordingly. So when we're talking about photography and painting, first off, photography, we're going to be talking about Lightroom. So Lightroom is a little confusing right now because there are many, many, many different Adobe Lightrooms. There's this icon you see here, which is called simply Adobe Lightroom. This is sort of new Lightroom that you can install on your desktop and manage your photos, and also, do exposure adjustments and things like that. Lightroom was always a way to sort of the darkroom experience and bringing it into, the desktop, into the digital world. So it started with Adobe Lightroom, which has now been relabeled to Adobe Lightroom Classic. And Lightroom Classic looks a little bit different. Lightroom Classic is meant to be completely desktop-based, completely a localized experience for professional photographers. Whereas Adobe Lightroom, the icon you see here with the rounded corners, this is more, it gives a lot of the same things to photographers. So you're able to organize your images, you're able to make adjustments to them and so forth and edit them. However, there is this additional cloud-based component to Lightroom now, where you can use Lightroom on your laptop and it'll actually sync all of your images and all of your edits to your Android device, to your iOS device, to another laptop. So if I install Lightroom on a Windows machine and I have it on my MacBook and I have it on my Android device, I can actually edit on any of those devices and they're all going to sync up perfectly. There's also a web component to this where you're able to go in and do some small edits using Lightroom on the web. So Lightroom has become like this massive photography ecosystem. And, people, most of the time simply don't, but there's a lot to it. And it can get kind of confusing if you don't understand that there are many different products with the Lightroom name and exactly how they come together. We have Photoshop, of course. So Photoshop goes a bit beyond Lightroom. Before Lightroom existed, Photoshop was kind of like, the place to go to edit photos, right? But Photoshop does so much more. There's so much compositing and manipulation and stuff like that now that you can do with Photoshop, where it's not sort of like the pure photographer's experience that you have with something like Lightroom. Lightroom is meant specifically for photography, whereas Photoshop is more for, it can be for photography, of course, but it's more for more creative endeavors that you might be handling. So layering different images upon themselves, doing lots of blend modes and, removing objects from one photo to another. Lots of times people on photo shoots, there's something distracting they need to get rid of. You can use Photoshop to get rid of that. And then we have Fresco. So Fresco is really cool. In the chat, has anybody ever used Fresco? Right now, it's only for the iPad, but it's like super neat because you're able to, it's basically being able to paint on your tablet. So you install Fresco and you can have these like realistic, so great. Somebody started using it. So yeah, definitely check out the watercolor brushes inside of Fresco. The watercolor brushes are amazing. You can control like the amount of water that's loaded onto your brush. You can paint only with water if you want. You can change every aspect of these different brushes and they behave like real watercolor brushes. It's incredible. They've got oil brushes too that you can use. And both of those are called like, I can't remember what they're called. They're expressive brushes. There's also like brushes like basic vector and bitmap brushes, which are also cool. But gosh, the watercolor experience is amazing. So the question is there a plan to have Fresco on devices? I think it might be available on Microsoft Surface as well right now. I'm not sure about that. But I know they're definitely looking at different devices for Fresco. They always tend to hit iPad first just because iPad's like a standard, right? And I guess the Surface is to some extent too, which is why, they have looked at Surface for some of these things. But I believe they are. I haven't heard anything new in a while regarding that sort of thing. But I would imagine they want to get this stuff out as much as they can because it is so neat. One of the cool things about Fresco, and if I can go back, about Photoshop and Fresco. So a lot of people might notice that the newer versions of Photoshop, the icons changed. It's now got those rounded edges. That's because you can now save Photoshop documents to the cloud. And that allows you to open up Photoshop documents just from wherever you are. You don't have to transfer files or anything like that, right? Fresco and Photoshop, you can actually open up a Fresco document inside of Photoshop. So if you did like a cool like watercolor background or thing and wanted to integrate that with some photography, you could pull that in and, work across these different applications. And that's really one of the really cool things about Creative Cloud. That a lot of these things really do work very, very closely together. Like inside of my big class right now that I'm teaching, that I actually talk before this. We're looking at After Effects and Premiere Pro and Audition. And all three of those work together really well to create, a really nice video compositing workflow, video sequencing workflow. And we'll see that a bit in here too. Oops. Yeah. So I have a brush that I like to use for refining edges? For refining edges. Yeah, so I'm not, I don't have one that I would jump out and say like, yeah, this one right here. So I don't really have a definitive answer for that question. There's another question, is Fresco in the Academic Creative Suite? Yeah, so if you have a subscription, you're able to install Fresco, but you're only able to install it on, an iPad or a Surface device right now. Actually, let's pop open. Let's take a little slide break here. And let's have a look at the desktop app. So inside of the desktop app, and this is kind of how you manage all of your different applications. You'll notice up here, up top, you've got the ability to view, like we're in all apps right now, and we can see the applications that are on desktop. And if we look down here, if we scroll, you can see that, oh, Fresco is not compatible with my desktop. All right, I'm on a Windows 10 machine right here. I've got a MacBook Pro upstairs, but even the MacBook Pro, if I go down here on desktop, I'd see that Fresco is not compatible with that machine either, even though it's a brand new MacBook Pro. The reason for that is because if you go to mobile up here, and you can see that Fresco is right now a completely mobile application. So you'd have to have a compatible mobile device in order to use it, right? So if you're curious where to find any of these things, as you see here, since I'm on the desktop, if I'm looking in mobile here, I'm not going to be able to download any of these to my desktop, right? So here's Lightroom mobile, Photoshop on mobile, Premiere Rush, and Fresco. So with any of these, if I click send link, what it's going to do is it's going to, just basically email me a link to where I can download it on either iOS or Android or whatever it might be. So if you look inside of the desktop application, it should show up there in the academic subscription for sure. In the past, there were issues with certain things not being available inside of, enterprise or academic subscriptions here, right? So things like Adobe fonts were restricted before. Adobe XD was a big restriction before for certain things. The more modern enterprise type plan. So over here, you've got web as well. And if we look through web, here we can see a lot of the different services that are available. And a lot of people overlook this stuff, right? So here you find Adobe Fonts, you've got Adobe Color, Portfolio, the Spark stuff I mentioned. Here's Lightroom on the web, so you can do that. And there's all sorts of stuff that you can look at here. I tend to disagree a little bit on some of the assignments that Adobe has made on some of these categories, but they're getting a little better at it. Like for instance, if we go down to video and motion here, we can find Adobe Animate right here, right? So Adobe Animate used to only be under UI and UX, which, yeah, it belongs there, but it belongs in other places too, right? So there's always like these little shifts that are happening. One of those shifts, actually, this is new this week. If you go to beta apps, you can actually try out betas for a lot of different things. So yeah, you Premiere and so forth. So you got all those different betas here that you can play with. You've also got resource links to stocks, different tutorials and so forth. There's all sorts of stuff inside of the desktop application. And really, the first time that you try to install any of these applications, like if you go and you try to install Photoshop, it's going to download Creative Cloud desktop, and it's going to install it on your Windows or your Mac OS machine. And then you're able to manage all that stuff in that way. So that's where you install stuff, that's where you update stuff, that's where you can remove stuff, it's where you can get access to tutorials, and it's also got like your own cloud-based documents. So it's actually a really nice application, and you'll notice right now it's like super white, right? What they're gonna, I've been told that there's gonna be a dark mode coming soon for this, thank goodness, because like every other Adobe app has dark mode, which is really nice on the eyes. Yeah. So let's see, how do you suggest to optimize performance? So there's a, yeah, I mean, it depends on the application, right? So certain applications, of course, use more or less power. Is it a specific application that you're looking to optimize performance on? Because lots of times, like there's a link that I share that goes to like all the different applications and what their kind of recommended specs are, right? So you can always use that as a guide. And depending upon what you're doing, like with something like Photoshop, you can define a scratch disk that's going to work as like additional memory. It's going to like write a bunch of files there as you're working. So it's not doing it on your, your main hard drive. So it kind of depends on how your system's set up, how you would go about optimizing some of the stuff. I would look for, to see what the particular guidelines are with a particular product. Like if you're having problems with something specifically, one thing to try is to blow away all the preferences. That's something that's often done if you're experiencing performance issues. But another thing is just to, just have a look at, what the basic hardware performance specifications are. One of those things. All right. So the next category here is graphic design stuff. So this is super important, of course. So Spark Post, we mentioned Spark a couple times. Spark Post is actually free to use. Preferences in, so it's asked what kind of preferences in opt. I'm not sure what that means. I mentioned blowing away your preferences. So there's always like different ways of like, yeah. So like when you start up any of these applications, and thank goodness some of them now have a checkbox inside of preferences where you can check a little checkbox in the preferences UI for like Photoshop or whatever. And it'll say like, hey, I want you to clear out all my preferences. I want you to blow them away next time I start Photoshop. And if you check that box, close out Photoshop, start it again, Photoshop will kind of be like new. So if there was any like accretions and junk in there, it might run better, right? But there are ways of doing that through keyboard shortcuts. I can't remember what the keyboard shortcuts are right now, but if you Google it, you should be able to find it. Just say like, blow away my preferences in Illustrator or Photoshop or whatever. And there's plenty of articles out there that say like, hold down Alt and Shift while you launch Photoshop, and a dialog will come up to say, do you want to blow away your preferences? And you say yes, and then they're gone. So that's an easy way to kind of start things out. There's also a sort of, it's a drastic tool. So there's a tool called the, gosh, what's it called? I can't recall what it's called exactly, but it's a Creative Cloud uninstaller tool that you can use to remove certain applications and all the preferences and so forth associated with those applications. That's something I would recommend as kind of a last resort, because it does like really blow, like it could blow away like everything that you have installed on Creative Cloud. It doesn't get rid of your files and your creations, of course, but any of your preferences, the applications themselves, you'd have to obviously like re-download and reinstall them. But that sometimes is a good way if you've been running that stuff for a while and you've got a lot of junk on your computer. from older versions of Creative Cloud applications, it's a good way to go through and just run that Creative Cloud uninstaller utility. You can Google that too. It'll come up pretty easily. It's a little download, and you just run it, and you say, yeah, I want you to blow everything away. And then, yeah, and then it's kind of like starting from scratch, you know? It's a nice tool, but again, depending upon what you need to have happen, it might be a little overkill. Yeah. So Spark Post is pretty cool. It's both web-based and mobile, and it allows you to do things like integrate graphics and text, and do so in a way that's like very smart. It sort of guides you through like what looks good, and you can cycle through a bunch of pieces of text and a bunch of layouts and colors and things like that until you get something you want. I often tell people like Spark Post is really good for like iterating on ideas. Like maybe you're trying to come up with this design and you've got like a photo of a cat and like a little piece of copy for a tagline. You can throw both of those things into Adobe Spark Post and then just start randomizing a bunch of stuff until something really strikes you, you know? And then you can take that and, you know, when you actually build that thing up inside of something like Photoshop or Illustrator, you know, it just gives you that initial idea. But Spark can certainly be used to create, you know, final graphics for things as well. Spark Post is often used for creating social media images. So things for, you know, Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and so forth. And the neat thing about Spark is like any of the Spark stuff is actually free. You do get some extra branding opportunities if you do have a subscription with Adobe Creative Cloud, but the base level of Spark is actually free for anybody to use. All right, so Illustrator is huge, right? It's actually the oldest Adobe application. I think it turned 30 this year, if I'm not mistaken. It's very old, but they've done a lot of really nice updates the past couple of years where the UI is completely modernized at this point. And if you're working with vector graphics, you're definitely going to want to use Illustrator. There's oftentimes like confusion from people who are just getting into Creative Cloud whether they should use Photoshop or Illustrator for a particular project. And lots of times, you know, students that I have, they will have used one or the other, and they might be more familiar with Illustrator or more familiar with Photoshop. And they'll ask things like, you know, like for this particular project, should I use Photoshop or Illustrator? And generally, you know, there's kind of like two ways of approaching that question. One way is to say, well, you know, is your project primarily bitmap based? So are you using a lot of photographic imagery in it? If that's the case, then I would use Photoshop primarily, although Photoshop does have vector tooling inside of it. And then I'd ask, well, if it's vector-based primarily, then I'd probably use Illustrator, even though you can use bitmaps inside of Illustrator. And to make things even more complicated, of course, Illustrator and Photoshop, you can link Photoshop documents and Illustrator files across each of those products, so making like this big loop, right? So they work together really well on top of all this. But I think it really comes down to more than the technical aspects of it. It's like, well, what are you most comfortable with, right? Like if you are doing a project and you're more comfortable working in Illustrator, then I'd say start in Illustrator. If you're more comfortable working in Photoshop, then start in Photoshop, right? And Photoshop, of course, can be used for graphic design. So layout for digital and print. So, you know, Photoshop and Illustrator, everybody knows these two, right? You know, lots of times when people just think about Adobe, they're either thinking Acrobat, they're thinking Flash Player, or they're thinking Photoshop, right? Photoshop itself is a verb at this point, even though we tried really, really hard to stop people from using it that way, but everybody knows Photoshop and Illustrator. We've got some other applications that we're going to go into now that are a bit more obscure, right? So if we start talking about layout for either digital or print. Probably the first thing that's going to come to mind for people who are somewhat aware of the different applications is going to be Adobe InDesign. So InDesign is, it's for creating digital and print publications. Create pages and you fill those pages with content. It's very typographically heavy. It's lots and lots of control over the way that text is laid out, the way characters are rendered inside the thing. I mean, if you like typography, I mean, InDesign is the thing to go to. However, with a lot of these applications, Illustrator to make it as effective as possible, because it doesn't have all the tools of the application. And, you can easily link and embed Photoshop new. So in terms of XD, yeah, so here's a question. If you're making something that will be online and in print, what's the best app? I'd say it depends on what needs to happen with the project, like the project specification. But if it's something that can be presented online and print both very easily, I'd say InDesign is definitely the thing to go to, simply because InDesign does give you both of those worlds inside the same application. So you could always, create kind of like two versions of your project. You could create the print one first, and then you could create the more digital interactive one as like a PDF, like publishing online as, InDesign has this publish online capability. There's actually like this big button that you can click to see if, got it. So the video has been disabled, everybody. I just got a message that there's a little bit of jamming going on. So to try to alleviate that, it's completely expected. We're just trying to make sure that, the audio is gonna be the best it can be. Yeah, so I would say InDesign, because there's a big publish online thing that you can do with InDesign. So if it's even just like a little newsletter or something, you can publish online and actually see, actually share that out with the world in that way. And it's a nice feature. If you've never used it, if you are an InDesign user, have a look at publish online. Sometimes you don't need the overkill of generating a big interactive PDF, right? Sometimes publish online is going to work really well for you. Yes, InDesign does incorporate different levels of interactivity. So you can include video inside of InDesign, hyperlinks, all sorts of different things. And I mean, it's got like some basic animation capabilities even. Accessibility checker, I'm not sure, Brad. I haven't looked at InDesign from an accessibility standpoint, so I can't answer that. But interactivity, for sure. All right. So XD is, I often group XD and InDesign together because they have a lot of similarities. XD also depends pretty heavily on other applications for certain things, incorporating, imagery from, again, something like Photoshop or Illustrator. What XD allows you to do is very similar to InDesign. It's a layout tool. And XD is meant to lay out screens specifically. So we're not talking about publications like, newsletters and magazines. With XD, we're more talking about websites and apps. So mobile apps, console games, different menus on digital TVs and things like that. Anything you can think of that has a screen, XD can be used to both design those screens and include prototyping on those screens. So having the ability to actually, again, we're talking about interactivity, to make these designs, to make these prototypes fully interactive. So somebody can actually walk through your project screen by screen and give you feedback on that before you actually hand it off to development. And then, then they go through stuff, and you don't want to find, right, user experience problems right at the end when you're developing. You want to find those problems out and discover those solutions early on in the process when you're designing. And that's one of the goals of using XD for something like that. Of course, Illustrator can also be used for things of that nature as well. So you can lay stuff out inside of Illustrator. It's got artboards, which you can use for screens. A lot of people used to use Photoshop or Illustrator to do screen design before XD came along, because XD is only a few years old. Oh, there's a question, would XD be a good tool for online course prototypes? I'm not sure exactly what you mean by online course prototypes. Are you saying like, yeah. I would say flow charting and things like that. You could definitely do some stuff in XD just to get a feel for, how somebody would approach the course and like different aspects of it. I've never used it in that way, but I bet you could. It's pretty open, the stuff that you can do with XD. Like, it doesn't assume anything really. It's just like, hey, why don't you create a bunch of screens and create content on those screens and then wire it all up together. So anything where you need to flow, as you mentioned here, flow charting, if you need something to flow from like one screen to another based on certain conditions or actions, XD is going to work really well for that. Right on. So I mentioned audio and video before. Audio and video is a big segment of the Creative Cloud. It's interesting that most people, when they start talking about Creative Cloud applications, the audio and video apps are sort of, I don't know what it is. Like, if it's almost like people generally kind of see them as like not primary, where like, I mean, the big three that people usually go to when they talk about Creative Cloud are Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign, right? So the audio and video stuff sometimes gets ignored a bit. However, the people that actually do use audio and video in these different applications, I mean, these applications are huge for different, different segments of the professional and creative workforce, right? So one thing that Adobe's done, which is kind of cool, is they've created another version of Premiere Pro. So Premiere Pro is basically like the professional non-linear video editor, video clip sequencer that you can use inside of Creative Cloud. But it's a massive thing, right? Premiere Rush is built upon sort of like the same guts as Premiere Pro. So you can actually open up a Premiere Rush project inside of Premiere Pro if you wanted to, and then like extend it through there. But Rush is a mechanism. So I'm being told that my internet connection is unstable through Zoom, I assume. I hope that's not the case. It shouldn't be.
You actually are sounding pretty good here.
Good
We're still getting an
whole
occasional jamming. But
internet connection. If I do drop out, I apologize. I'll try to be back as soon as I can if that happens. Okay, good. Yeah, it might be just Zoom being a little proactive here. All right, cool. Oh, Dreamweaver. Yeah, I've got Dreamweaver in here in the next segment, I think. So yeah, we'll talk about Dreamweaver in a bit as well. So Premiere Rush is meant as sort of like, not so much an introduction. It's for people who want to do video stuff using professional tools, but they don't necessarily need everything that Premiere Pro gives them. And very similar to how Lightroom works, there's a little bit of editing capability for audio in there, a little bit. It's not something like, it's not like what Audition provides, but you can definitely edit certain aspects of audio clips inside of Rush. Think of Rush as like a little version of Premiere Pro that you can use on your desktop or on your Android device or on your iPad or iPhone. It's available through all of those different things. And like Lightroom, it allows you to sync your different files, right? And all the editing that goes with that, except we're dealing with video and audio here instead of photographs, right? So it's a similar model. With Rush, the big driver for Rush is, again, social media. So, if you have to like come up with some video content like really quickly, Rush is a really good way to do that and then share it out immediately to different social media channels. We already talked a little bit about Premiere Pro, but that's the professional sequencer that you would use if you were editing video. We've got After Effects. So After Effects is motion design. It's, as you see here, cinematic movie titles, intros. It's got a lot of robust stuff that you would think about finding inside of Photoshop for still images. After Effects is kind of like Photoshop for video, for motion. You generally would not want to create like a huge sequence thing with After Effects. After Effects can work very, very closely with Premiere Pro. So between Premiere Pro and After Effects, there is this engine called Dynamic Link, where you can actually like create a composition in After Effects and dynamically link it as a clip inside of Premiere Pro. And it allows you to work on your After Effects project without ever having to render it to include it in an actual video sequence project. It's really cool how that works. There's a question, is there a light version of After Effects? No, there's not. And After Effects is a massive, massive application. There's like so much to it. And a lot of people, when they first approach After Effects, they get instantly overwhelmed with both like how much stuff you can do, but also how different it is, right? It's very different from a lot of the other applications and how basic things work, like renaming a layer in After Effects. You don't double click that layer to rename it. You have to actually hit enter. It's completely different from every other Adobe application. Any tutorial After Effects in Premiere? Gosh, so years ago, I used to go to like Creative Cow for that stuff, but I would say there's a lot of stuff there that's probably still good. Anything on LinkedIn Learning is going to be great. A lot of people have access to that just through their schools. So, I would check that. But additionally, any of these applications, if you go to Adobe's website for these applications, there will be a big Learn button or in the navigation for the thing. And if you go there, you're going to find a bunch of different tutorials and things like that for the product, specifically for beginners, for intermediates, for advanced stuff. So, Adobe.com itself is a really good place to go to view tutorials about this stuff. All right. So if you're going through, you're going to want to edit your audio too, and Adobe Audition is great for editing audio. So it allows both the editing and recording of just straight audio WAV files, but you can also assemble audio as a session mixdown. So you can actually use it as a digital audio workstation as well. Depends on your needs, of course. All right. So I think we're doing okay for time. We're now on motion graphics and animation. So After Effects again, motion graphics and animation, you can certainly do well inside of After Effects, but you can also do this stuff inside of Adobe Animate. So Animate is a way of giving you the capability of both creating animated and motion content. But in addition to that, you know, if you're dealing with After Effects, you're basically exporting the After Effects stuff to video. It's a totally video-centric workflow. With Animate, you can export your stuff to video, but you can also make it interactive. So you can have interactive elements in there, and you can export that to an HTML5 canvas element. You can export it as an actual game or application that you can run on a mobile device or a desktop. There's lots and lots of different ways to go through that. And Animate is perfect for creating content that can be embedded in like a Canvas course, right? So if you want a little like, you know, demonstration, interactive demonstration of how like a certain process works, Animate is perfect for that. We have character animator too. Steep learning curve in Animate, it depends. You know, a lot of people find it difficult, but then a lot of people also find it easier to use than After Effects. It seems to be a very personal thing, like where the person is coming from, right? So if you've dealt with Premiere before and you're used to a more video workflow, then After Effects might be simpler. But if you're working more from a standpoint of coming from like Illustrator or Photoshop or something, then I would say Animate might be easier. But yeah, who knows? It's always very random who kind of attaches to what between those two. But they also work together very well too. You can open up an Animate project directly inside of After Effects. So you could always start in start in Animate and then open up to finish in After Effects. And that's like a lot of television programs actually do that. You know, that's kind of like their workflow. All right, character animator is more for live animation. Basically, you create a puppet and then you're able to use your webcam and your microphone to animate the character and make a recording of that. It's great for live stuff. So somebody asked about Dreamweaver before. So I've got Dreamweaver in here, of course. Spark Page is a way to ease levels. Dreamweaver, of course, is an it's an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript editor. And what's nice about Dreamweaver, it lets you work in sort of like a what you see, you get mode, but it also lets you work robustly in the code. So no matter how you're approaching web development or web design, Dreamweaver kind of gives you a lot of different options and how you want to work with that stuff. And of course, Animate does stuff for web as well. If you export stuff for WebGL or HTML5 Canvas, or even the new VR virtual reality platforms, you can target the web. And we've got XD, which we've already mentioned. It's also good for, of course, specking out websites. So the last section here is kind of the weirdest, 3D and XR. And I'm gonna buzz through these pretty quick because I only have like 2 minutes left. So we've got Adobe Dimension, which is super, super cool. Adobe Dimension is Adobe's kind of like first major 3D application. It allows you to use some textures and materials and create some nice scenic stuff you can then export to something like Photoshop to finish up. Dimension is super, super cool. If you haven't played with it, I suggest you do. Arrow is an augmented reality application, right now only available for iPad. And that lets you actually place like Photoshop documents and 3D models from Dimension and things like that in physical space and be able to explore them through your device's camera. And then Animate itself has a couple of different virtual reality type applications that you can build with that. Interactive VR, so very different from the stuff you would find inside of video only VR stuff. All right, so I know the last section we went through pretty quick. I'm gonna answer the questions here in the couple minutes that we have left. But I just want to say thank you first, and here's a couple of ways of connecting with me through email and Twitter and LinkedIn and so forth. So let's see, there's a question here. Will Dreamweaver continue to be supported? It seems like it is continuing to be supported. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know the future, of course, but they do provide pretty regular updates on that. Yeah, Flash. So there's like two things people mean when they say Flash, right? So we're mostly talking about Flash Player, which is a web browser plugin. And yeah, so after this year, the Flash Player plugin is being completely deprecated and removed from most browsers, right? So yeah, if people are still doing stuff for Flash Player, I mean, in my opinion, Flash Player is actually a really understated platform. It's super, super powerful for what it used to be able to let you do. However, yeah, it's not something you really want to use anymore for stuff. That's completely different, of course, from Flash Professional, which is the desktop project that's been rebranded as Adobe Animate, because Animate supports, all sorts of different platforms. So no worries there. All right, so it's 10:50, and I've been told that time is time. So thank you everyone for coming, and reach out to me with these additional links if you want to, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Yeah, we are going to go ahead and wrap up this meeting here in just a minute or so. If you saw the link to the survey, please do fill that out. It always helps us to improve our conference. And if you missed any part of this, we will have a recording online. It may not get posted until next week, but recordings will be available.